Okay, let's go into the second session. And in this one, I want to talk about the period after Stalin dies, what happens, and the changes that take place in the bloc, particularly in Central Europe, particularly in Hungary, in 1946. I want to talk a little bit about how that affects, how the end of Stalin and the coming of Nikita Khrushchev, mentioned briefly in the lecture before, changes the direction of Central and Eastern Europe, and kind of shows us the limits of how far the Soviet Union will let their satellite states off the leash, and just how painful it can be, and how dangerous it can be for the countries in question if they stray too far from the prescribed levels and the prescribed limits of liberalization in the interwar period. And before I do, I was running on quite long. I honestly thought that the last session would be quite a short one. I thought we would be done in about 30 or 40 minutes, but it went on for another hour. I don't know why that was. I just suddenly realized that there was quite a lot to say about that. But I have three slides. I'm going to be much quicker in this one, I promise. I have three slides that I can show you just to wrap up. In the last session, and I don't know when you watched it, how long ago, but I only just finished recording it, so it's very fresh in my mind. In the first three slides of this slideshow, I just put some pictures which I think are interesting about this. It gives an image. It gives a face to this kind of transformation that I was talking about. I told you that when the communists came to power, they were great constructivists. They were building roads, building places to live. That they were really trying to move people into the big cities as well, away from the villages. That they believed, that on the one hand, that the future of the national economies, the nationalized economies, would be based on industry and modern production, and not so much on agriculture as it had been in the interwar period. So they wanted people to sort of live urban lives. They wanted them to come into these cities that were swelling, they were expanding in the period immediately after the Second World War. So of course they had to build places also for them to live. In this first slide, you can see the largest communist housing development in the Balkans, a so-called New Belgrade. So Belgrade now, once upon a time, the capital of Serbia, today the capital of Serbia, but after the Second World War became the capital of Tito's state, the Yugoslav socialist state, the communist state. It was a relatively small city on one bank of the Danube, where the Danube and the Sava rivers meet. But to the north of those rivers, what was at that point just villages, were completely sort of transformed into massive, into this massive kind of housing estate. I'm not sure if any of you have been to Belgrade. I used to live there, so I have strong feelings about it. Or I spent a lot of time there when I was a student. There is, this just goes on forever and ever, and there are, hundreds of thousands of people living there. It ultimately was where, we'll talk about this later, but the convicted war criminal, Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader, was hiding in one of these buildings, in complete disguise, but he was also sort of living there. Just gives you a sense of how easily one can get sort of lost in this urban sprawl. In page number 2, that's what it looks like in what is today the Croatian capital, what was back then part of Yugoslavia, Croatia, so that the capital Zagreb. This is the Savica estate. There's nothing particularly special or interesting about this state, but this is actually where I used to live also when I was a PhD student. When I was preparing my doctoral dissertation, I lived there for about a year. So I just wanted to show you, just in case you're interested. My building is the one on the I'm in the building taking the picture, so you can't see the building that I'm in, but it was very similar to these ones. And these are in the slide number 3. This is in Prague. which I'm not quite sure which part of Prague that is. I have an idea, but I won't say because I'm not 100% sure. But again, they're called panelaki because they're prefabs. They're made out of paneled. They're made, they're very easy to construct, very cheap. And they're relatively solid living spaces. And these, and also I quite like in this picture these great communist era cars, the Skoda and the Ladas, which are also very cheap and mass produced, and actually pretty durable. I mean, if you go to ex-Soviet spaces, particularly like Central Asia, you can see people still driving around these cars. They're like Cadillacs in Cuba, right, in Havana. They're very sturdy and very well built, but very cheap cars. They're not sports cars or anything like this, but they do go have good engines. So now all of these, if you've been to anywhere in Central and Eastern Europe, you'll know that these housing blocks are still around, and they're not particularly well loved by the people. They're not considered. They're not like Baroque buildings or buildings from the 19th century. They're not, the architecture is not well loved. Although in the 70s and the 80s there was some interest in the architectural design, and some of that is coming back now with a new generation of people who didn't actually have to sort of live in them. So they're a little bit they're not well loved, and very often, I mean, if they go on forever, they're like dormitories. You simply sleep there. And then in the morning you get on the bus and you go to the city, or if you're going out for a night on the town, you would leave there and you'd only come back there to sort of sleep. But nevertheless, they were a higher standard of living. I mean, take Belgrade, for example. The people who, before these housing estates had been built, were living in villages. Essentially, the communists came along and said, "Look, you're not going to live in this little cottage anymore. You're going to live in this apartment." And then there was anger and uncertainty about this. But when those people, in most cases, saw the upgrading quality with running water and electricity and heat, and space and all of this kind of thing, very often they recognized that this was a better standard of living. That they weren't living like the king or the queen, or they weren't living like the very wealthiest of the communists, but nevertheless they could live well in these things. It's just precisely what happened to my landlord in Zagreb. Was quite an old guy. His father had taken this option. There had been a village in Savica, the picture that I just showed you, in slide number two. That they came along at the end of the Second World War. That this was in the 50s, I think. Savica was built, and they said, "Look, this new apartment is going to be much better for you. It's going to be an improvement in your way of life," and indeed it was, and many people were quite happy with that. There is a new interest, as I said, and I can show you some websites where a new generation of Poles and Czechs and Slovaks and Hungarians and Latvians and Estonians are taking an interest in the architecture and the design, in the way these things were constructed. I mean, they were cheap places to live. Rent in these places was like 1% of people's income. Compare that to sort of the 50% that many of us pay in the 21st century. So they did have their advantages. There's a very good book. There are several good books on this process of building these estates and these sometimes entire cities out of nothing. And what I think is the best book, my favorite book on this topic, is a book by an Oxford historian called Catherine Lebeau, who wrote a book called Unfinished Utopia. It's a book about a city called Nowa Huta, which the Polish Communist Party built from scratch. It's just outside of Krakow. In the 1950s, from 1941 until 1956, and you can see that the communists envisage an entire kind of society with schools and hospitals. It's just very like, I'm going to show my age now, but it's very much like the computer game SimCity, where in order to be successful, you can't just build loads and loads of places to live. You also have to build schools and hospitals and parks and recreation and transport and all this kind of thing. The communists, given that they controlled the entire the entire economy and the entire state, they did have they were capable. They did have the sort of the means to design cities from scratch, and they very often did think, okay, what's this family going to be? Where are they going to go? Where are the children going to go? Where's the father going to? How far is the father going to go to work? Is there going to be a kindergarten, like a creche for the children? What about if they want to play sports? What about if they want to go get some food or get a beer or something? Where are they going to go to do that? They thought about this in totality, and very often living in one of these places today is like that. That you have everything. You have everything close to hand, including places to go dancing and all of this kind of thing. Okay, so let's now then talk eventually about de-Stalinization. Now, this began, if we look at let's jump to slide number 6. In 1953, in March 1953, Stalin dies. Had been ill for a while. He had been not ill for a while. He sort of emerged, got ill and died relatively quickly. Now, there was a power struggle after his death. It lasted for a few years, and the ultimate victor of this power struggle was a man called Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev would become the first secretary, so the leader of the Communist Party and the leader of the Soviet Union from sort of the end of 1953, beginning of 1954, up until the period where he himself was deposed from power in 1964, so about a decade later. So power shifts from Stalin and over to Khrushchev. Many of you will have heard of what I think is a very good, funny, and good film in slide number 8, a comedy, would you believe, about Stalin called The Death of Stalin, which depicts this period, this power struggle. In the light of Stalin's death, puts it, puts it in sort of quite, compresses it into a period of time, much shorter period of time, but basically depicts the very fraught power struggle, particularly between Khrushchev and Beria. In the wake of the death of Stalin, a lot of uncertainty. No one knows which direction the country is going in. Is it going to stay on the same path? Is it going to go on a different path? Ultimately, Khrushchev is the victor of this. This battle. So I recommend this film. Now, the uncertainty was no less felt within the Eastern Bloc, within countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Ostensibly, they had their own governments, they had their own foreign policy, they had their own direction, their own autonomy. But in reality, of course, after Tito had left the Bloc, those countries were very, clearly subordinate to the Soviet Union, part of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance, part of Comecon, the economic alliance of communist states. They were ultimately beholden to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union called the shots. And what that meant up until 1953, of course, was that Stalin called the shots. Now, when Stalin died, this also opened up a period of uncertainty within Eastern and Central Europe. It was not clear what this death and what this power struggle and this subsequent rising of power of Khrushchev meant to the states in the bloc. Would this mean a radical change in policies? Would this mean liberalization? What kind of a person was Khrushchev? What kind of a figure would he be? What kind of a leader would he be? What would be the implications of his rule? Now, there were certain signals early on. It's all very mysterious. In the Cold War, people used to call it Kremlinology, trying to work out, trying to divine the smoke signals which were coming out of Moscow. They were no less mysterious for the people, the leaders and the societies in Central and Eastern Europe. They weren't sure what these changes in the Soviet Union meant, and they were not sure what Khrushchev would mean. Now, this is very important. The people, of course, now, because the parties, as I mentioned in our last session, had been purged, because those people who were not supporters and not loyal to Stalin had now either been imprisoned or executed or removed from the power structures within those countries. What it meant in principle was that you had a lot of small Stalins, a lot of people like the Hungarian leader Miklos Rákosi, people who were simply carbon copies of Stalin and who owed their political fortunes to Stalin as well. So when Stalin died, of course, they were quite concerned about how this might make changes and how this might mean dramatic changes also for their control within the countries. They weren't sure what was coming. Now, there were certain signals, as I said. It became one of the keystones. What people didn't realize at the time, at least immediately at the time, but what began to become more and more clear as the months and the years went by, was that in fact Khrushchev would try to chart a different course from the one that had been charted by his predecessor Stalin. Ultimately, he would break entirely, or try to break entirely, from Stalin's reign and from the way Stalin ran the country. And this began to become clear in sort of 44, 45. One of the key moments or ongoing moments was Khrushchev's attempt to bring Tito back into the bloc. Tito in Yugoslavia, of course, Yugoslavia is still a communist country. Tito's still a communist, but now charting their separate path, as we saw in last sessions, in the lectures that I recorded for our last session. Khrushchev was desperate that this rift would be healed. He visited Tito numerous times, and he attempted to persuade Tito that the era of Stalinism was over, that the new relations would be forged between the Soviet Union and the various bloc countries, and that there was now once again a place for Tito within the Warsaw Pact, within the family, the community of communist states, that he would not have to sacrifice, that he would not have to compromise on his own independent line, on his own, on the independent course which he appeared to be taking. Ultimately was not successful. He was not able to bring Yugoslavia back into the communist bloc, but he made very many strenuous efforts, in some cases really sort of abasing himself at the feet of Tito, hoping that he could bring the Yugoslavs back into the bloc. Now, what this meant was a more general change in foreign policy. Khrushchev was sort of indicating to the rest of the Central European and Eastern European states that now the Soviet Union would no longer be demanding that politically, economically, and socially those countries would toe the line with the Soviet Union. He was now using words like polycentrism. He was saying, look, many centers, right? He was saying, it's no longer necessary to do things the Moscow way, to do things the Soviet way. We understand that the communist bloc comprises states with very different societies, very different economies, very different histories, very different legacies, and that now we're willing to sort of acknowledge those differences, and we're willing to respect them. A lot of this was coming down to the fact that the initial economic policies, the ones that I outlined in the previous lecture, were not being successful, particularly things like collectivization, which was really unpopular and was in many cases not working. But there are also things like some of the 5-year plans, some of the industrialization that the Soviet Union under Stalin had insisted upon. Also, this was failing, or there are economic problems, and the Stalinist model was perhaps not. The most was not the most flexible and not the best way to deal with these with these economic issues, with these economic problems. So the Soviet Union under Khrushchev was starting to talk about separate paths towards socialism. Now, this has to be understood advisedly. What Khrushchev was not saying was that these countries could break from the bloc. Under no circumstances was this to be allowed, as we'll find out when we talk about Hungary. What he was saying was that there were, the communism maybe after all was more complicated and more varied than people had thought. In the Soviet Union itself, there were changes in political and economic path. The ones that were being taken by Khrushchev. He wasn't following the line that had been set out for him by Stalin. In that case, it logically followed that maybe these other Eastern European and Central European states that had until now been following very closely the Stalinist path, maybe they too could start thinking more autonomously, start thinking more flexibly, that they could take control of their economies and start to organize them in the best way possible. So basically, this is what Khrushchev seemed to be saying. Again, it's not entirely clear, but he's essentially sort of saying, look, so long as communism and the Communist Party remains in tow, remains in power, and so long as these countries remain part of the socialist bloc, part of the bloc subordinated to the Soviet Union, we now acknowledge that there are more ways to skin a cat, that there are more ways to arrive at communist economy and communist society. So certain restrictions were being lifted, certain liberalizations, certain changes in policy direction within the Soviet Union to be allowed also in Central and Eastern Europe. But the bottom line, the red line was that the Communist Party should remain in power and this bloc should remain in the control of the Soviet Union. Now, this really took off in 1956, and it was because, in no small part, of a so-called secret speech that Khrushchev delivered at the 20th Party Congress, the 20th Communist Party Congress, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, of course, in which Khrushchev got up and spoke at length, which is to say, spoke for several hours, of denouncing the Stalinist period, talking about the Great Terror, talking about a cult of Stalin's personality, talking about the mistakes that Stalin made, not being prepared for the Second World War, essentially trouncing, rubbishing almost the entire legacy of Stalinism right up until his death in 1953. This was hugely shocking. And this went right back to the early days, right back to the period where Stalin took power, right back to the period where he took over from Lenin in the middle end of the 1920s. Khrushchev was completely obliterating the track record of his predecessor of Stalin. It was incredible. Incredible sort of incredible denunciation. Now, partially he was doing this because he wanted to establish his own authority, establish his own control, which was still relatively insecure, despite the fact that he had now killed Beria, his main opponent, and he seemed to be in control of the Politburo. That there was still a sense that he could be vulnerable unless he sort of said, all that's gone before is finished. This is the period of Khrushchev. I'm now the guy who's in power. Now, it was called a secret speech, but it was a misnomer. It was very quickly leaked. It was intercepted by the West, by Radio Free Europe, which then broadcast it back into verbatim back into Central and Eastern Europe, and very quickly Eastern and Central Europe got a whiff of this of this new direction on the part of the Soviet Union. So what this meant was that if we think now again about what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe, since the death of Stalin in 1953, you've had these kind of tremors. You've had this sense that maybe we don't exactly know what is changing, but it seems that something is changing within the Soviet Union, and this will have ramifications for our own economies, for our own societies, for our own relationship with the communist rule and with the Soviet Union. It looks like Nikita Khrushchev is a different person than Stalin. Of course he is, that's an obvious thing to say, but that his political direction and his relationship vis-a-vis the satellite states of Central and Eastern Europe will be a different one that changes in the air. So that's gradually being felt out, and then you see things like in 1955, Khrushchev visits Belgrade, visits the Soviet Union, visits Yugoslavia, visits Tito, indicates that he wants a different relationship with Yugoslavia, and then ergo he wants a different relationship with the rest of the bloc. So it's beginning to look like things are going to be different going forwards. And then in 1956, in the middle of all of this, you have this bombshell speech, you have this incredible denunciation of everything that's come before, which seems to indicate a very radical shift in the Soviet Union, but also a root and branch shift in the policy of the Soviet Union from the very top to the very bottom. So it's quite an exciting time. And now it's not exciting for everyone, of course. Imagine how much you'd be sweating. You'd be sweating spinal fluid if you were somebody like Rakosi, one of those miniature Stalins who owed his entire political success to being more Catholic than the Pope, to sort of acting as much as like Stalin as anyone had ever acted before. All of a sudden, not only is your patron dead, but his successor is apparently charting a very radically different course. And this will put your position, of course, in considerable jeopardy. All of a sudden, the people that you buried, the people that you put on trial, the Slanskys and we didn't talk about them, but people like Anna Pauker and Kosta Trikov Anna Pauker in Romania, Kosta Trikov in Bulgaria, various other people. All of a sudden, they're being rehabilitated, and your track record is being called into question. Now, the most original approach was the guy that we talked about in last week's session, Enver Hoxha. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Stalinist. He was desperately insecure and desperately terrified of these visits that Khrushchev was making to Yugoslavia. He felt that it was deja vu, that 1955 was looking more and more like 1945, that if there was a rapprochement between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, once again little Albania would be sacrificed and he would be dead meat. So Hoxha's approach to this was quite an original one. He simply resisted any kind of this process of what would become known as de-Stalinization. So no rehabilitation of the people he had killed, no changes in the economic direction, no changes in the political direction, denouncements of Khrushchev, which was quite a brave thing to do, and basically digging into the sort of the Stalinist line, saying no, it's untrue what they're saying about Stalin. There was no cult of personality. Stalin had it right all along, and we're sticking. There was no great terror, or if there was, it was necessary, and we're sticking to the line that we have stuck to since we came into power at the end of the Second World War. Now, as I mentioned a week ago, Hoxha never departed from that line. He remained up until his dying days, which would you believe were in 1985. He remained a dyed-in-the-wool Stalinist and a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of his political hero, Stalin. He remained true to him, building statues of him wherever people were tearing him down. He stuck to his guns and ultimately ended up with Mao, and then he fell out with Mao in China, and basically in his last 15 or 20 years he was on his own. He was a Billy No Mates in the communist world. Can't believe I just called him that. Anyway, that was a radical and quite an extreme approach to the issue, but in many cases, the other communists in the bloc came to terms with this. The people who had been close to Stalin were now in the descendant. New forces were in the ascendant. People who were close to Khrushchev, people who also understood that this change was coming. Now, the biggest shockwaves, the biggest changes took place in Poland and in Hungary. And these changes, the changes took place there precisely because communism had always been an ill-fitting solution to those countries. There had never been, as we saw when we talked about Czeslaw Milosz, and we're seeing now as well, the communist parties had always been particularly small. Their fit to the communist regime, to the Soviet bloc, was always a difficult one. In Poland, people despised the Russians. There was not a lot of love lost between Russia and Hungary. The communist parties, as I say, had not been big. Now their economic policies were failing. It was always a very difficult fit. Communism had always been a very difficult fit in those countries. And this new change, this polycentrism, the changes that Khrushchev seemed to be making in those countries looked like opportunities to try to maybe refit the communist system in a sort of better way. Now, it began in Poland. At the beginning of Poland, there are strikes in 1956, the beginning of the year, strikes in a city, called Poznan, where workers went on strike because they weren't getting paid. The price of bread was rising. It's the usual story of people getting exasperated with the conditions that they're living in. They don't like the communist system anyway. They're becoming increasingly critical of it, and this becomes sort of a potential problem. You have workers striking. They're not legally allowed to do this under communism. Why would they need to strike? It's a workers' state, right? But all of a sudden you have people striking. Police are called in, and they try to put this down. They fire on the protesters. Around 50 people are killed. So there's bloodshed. Blood on the streets of Poznan. This is a serious problem. And the factory workers, their protests are becoming increasingly political and directed not just against the shortages, but against the Communist Party itself, and against even the Soviet Union. So it's beginning to look like in 1956 in Poland, this country might begin to break away, or it might start to seriously challenge the political control of the Communist Party. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the political control of the Communist Party was absolute in Central and Eastern Europe, and that was not a negotiating point. You could talk about things like the position of the church. You could talk about maybe amnesties for Home Army soldiers, many of whom have been arrested, if not killed. They could still be amnestied even though they've been killed, of course. Wouldn't do them much good, but their families could get a pension and this kind of thing. But you could not challenge the political hegemony of the Communist Party. That was a red line, and it looked like the Polish people were beginning to do that. An emergency trip was made by Khrushchev to Poland, to Warsaw. If you know anything about Khrushchev, Khrushchev incidentally was one of those, like Brezhnev, his successor. He was somebody who came from a very modest background and rose up through the communist system and the Soviet system in the 1920s and the 1930s as a result of these new opportunities that the communists were opening up to people from humble backgrounds. So people from the working classes like him were given greater opportunities in the workplace. They were given greater opportunities for education. But he remained quite rough. in his ways. So it sounds like a slightly patronizing way of putting it. But he was quite coarse in the way he talked. Did not have much of a formal education despite his opportunities. Occasionally on the international stage, for example, when he was talking at the UN, addressing the UN, he would get quite florid and quite, sort of hyped up and quite overheated. You would start to see that he was what the Russians would call basically a muzhik, like a country bumpkin or something like this. That began to shine through. And it did when he came to Poland in 1956. The plane landed. The Soviet government plane landed. There was a huge, there was a red carpet and lots of ceremony, and the communist leader, Berut, came onto the tarmac to meet him, and even before he'd gotten off, he was literally he was on the steps, still on the tarmac. He even before he started shaking hands and curtsying and all this kind of thing, he was already wagging his finger and yelling at the Polish communist leadership that they must get this back in order. That they must control this situation immediately. That they must restore the control of the Communist Party, and the inference was that if they did not do that, then of course the Soviet Union and the Red Army would be able to do so. They had already done so, of course, at the end of the Second World War. It was barely 10 years since that had happened, and they were more than willing to do that again. So that was the situation. In this case, the Polish Communist Party just about did manage to restore order. It was a tight-run thing. They used violence, but they also made concessions to the workers, restored communist figures like Gomułka, Władysław Gomułka, who had been purged at the end of the Second World War, but who had been quite a popular figure, relatively speaking, a popular figure, as popular as you can be. As a Polish communist, Gomułka is in slide number 14. He was restored to the general secretary of the Communist Party. Certain concessions were made. Wages were increased. Home Army veterans were given pensions and amnesties, as I mentioned earlier. The Polish Catholic Church was given some leeway to have ceremonies and to have mass and that kind of thing, and that more or less worked. People were still pissed off and people were still disappointed with what was happening, but just about this crisis was averted, and what could have become a very serious problem was just about capped. Now, it was not the case in Hungary. Again, just like Poland, a country where the Communist Party had never been particularly popular, had always been a bit of a loose fit. There had been many parts of the society that were opposed to the communist regime, to the communist rule, and they once again, were sort of this period of Khrushchev's polycentrism, and the changes that Khrushchev were making looked to many people in Hungary like an opportunity to restore some legitimacy, or at least even to gain for the first time some legitimacy for the Hungarian Communist Party. So it was considered to be an opportunity. Now Stalin's Hungary's little Stalin, the guy that I've already talked about, was a man called Matyas Rákosi. There he is in slide number 17. 17. He was somebody, as I said earlier, who owed all of his fortunes, such as they were, to Stalin. And when Stalin left the show, when Stalin left the picture, once again, the fate of Rákosi looked to be particularly precarious. It was not certain that he would be able to sort of hold the reins. So, what happened then? That there was, his key rival during this period. If we turn to slide number 18, was a man called Imre Nagy. And Nagy became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1956. It had been back and forth with Rakoshi and with a man called Ernogero, who had also been, also been of the Stalinist set, of the Stalinist mold. Naj hoped that this Khrushchev period of de-Stalinization and reform and polycentrism would be an opportunity, in fact, to reinforce the control of the Communist Party. He was a loyal, a faithful communist, albeit not a particularly marked Stalinist. And for Naj, what this meant was that they could reform the Communist Party, invite elements of society which had been excluded from the discussion and excluded from power before that, begin a conversation with them, and maybe in this way, this would not be to dilute the power of the Communist Party, but in fact it would be to retrench the power of the Communist Party, that by inviting in these non-communist forces, opening up this discussion about the economy, about politics, about all of these sorts of things, perhaps in this way, Hungarian communism could become a force to be reckoned with. So this meant that in many cases he talked to intellectuals who had been ostracized by the Communist Party. He discussed people who had been active in the interwar period. Not with Nazis, of course, not with the Arrow Cross. There was no chance of that. But by people who had been sort of marginalized or had been, as I say, ostracized by the communists up until this point, up until 1956. And Naj hoped that in this way, a kind of communist control, a communist party Mark II would emerge with better economic policies, an improved version of what had been there since the end of the Second World War, what had been there, since in the period of Stalin's life, and that this was a way to improve the lot of the Hungarians. Now, you can read about this in Crampton, and you can read about this in other books. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially what happened was this got away from Naj very quickly. What began as a reform began to look much more like a revolution. Once Naj had allowed this genie out of the bottle, it was very difficult for him to get it back in, which is a bit of a problem with genies, as many of us will know, as many of you will know. He was not able to reverse the trends that he had set in motion. And what this meant was that these non-communist forces, initially being invited into this big tent discussion about the political and the economic future and the cultural future of the country, now began to lead the way. They were taking the initiatives. They were showing the direction that this country might go in. And it began again to look, just as it had, albeit on a smaller scale and more briefly in Poland, that the Communist Party would in fact lose control of this state. Now, Naj was desperate to rein in. He didn't want this to go so far. He was a communist. He believed in communism. He believed that the communist system was the best way forward, and he was mortified that he was now seeing what looked like forces of counter-revolution taking hold within the country. That it could be that if these reforms continued, it might mean the very end of communist rule. Now, of course, the Soviets themselves were also extremely concerned about that possibility. Khrushchev had never said this in no uncertain terms. Perhaps he felt it didn't need to be said. But the bottom line of polycentrism, the bottom line of the liberalization that he was allowing, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, was that it was not to be allowed. It was not to be allowed to challenge the hegemony and the control of the Communist Party. If this happened, then Khrushchev and whoever was in question would have a serious problem. And now, Naj indeed did have a serious problem. He was not able to get back control of the Communist Party. He was not able to get control of these non-communist forces that he had invited into this discussion. And it looked like a lot of people were saying, well, do you know what? If we're going to reform this country properly, why don't we just cast aside entirely the communist regime, and we can do things a lot better without them. So what happened then was at the end of the year, in October 1956, we could turn to slide number 20. The Soviet Union, the Red Army, invaded Hungary. The intention was to restore law and order, to restore communist control, to liquidate the non-communist forces, and to bring this country back into the bloc, bring this country back under the firm control of the communist bloc. Now, from their perspective, the Soviet Union and the loyal parts of the Communist Party, of which there were still many, including the police and the army. The notion here is that what was happening was a counter-revolution. That they thought, well, look, it's 1956, don't forget, and they're thinking, well, it's only been a decade since we got rid of the fascists, and since we got rid of the dictatorship, and since we got rid of all of those terrible things that had been in power and had been in force before we came to power. Now it looks like they're making a comeback, and something needs to be done about this very quickly. We need to eradicate these forces. We need to remove them. These are fascists coming back onto our streets. There were very many people who didn't think that, of course, and there were very many people who saw this, believed this was an opportunity to free themselves from what they thought was an oppressive system, and what had become a very oppressive system. And for many people who were part of this reform, what was becoming more like a revolution against the Hungarian Communist Party, the invasion of the Soviet Union in October 1956 seemed to prove the point that this was simply a military occupation, that this was not some kind of political partnership, that this was not done in the interests of the Hungarian people, but that in fact this was an invading force. So there was a conflict, there was a war, lasted from October to November 1956. Around 2,500 Hungarians were killed, about 700 Soviet troops, and ultimately about 200,000 Hungarians fled as refugees, many of them to the west of Europe. It is a point that I never fail to bring up with the current Hungarian government, who, as many of you will know, are passionately anti-refugee and will not allow virtually a single one of them into Hungary. There was a time 70 years ago when Hungarians were themselves refugees, and they were, if not welcomed, at least allowed into countries to flee persecution, to flee killing, to flee war, which is of course basically the only thing the refugees want, and the thing, of course, that everyone deserves. Okay, Kardar was Naj was executed. Ultimately, sought shelter in the Yugoslav embassy. Tito betrayed him. He was arrested, sent to the Soviet Union, put on trial back in Hungary, admitted culpability quite bravely to pretty much everything. The reason he did this is because he would be able to save many lives, if not his own. And he was executed. He was hanged in 1958 in Budapest. Up until recently, there was a monument of him in Budapest that's now been moved. Because any kind of communist, even one who's a reformer and a self-sacrificing one, is no longer allowed it seems, in Budapest. Paradoxically enough, what happened now in Hungary, the new leader was a man called János Kádár. Under Kádár, there was a retrenchment of the Communist Party, but there was also a relaxation of certain rules, certain strictures. It was almost as if the Communist Party was saying, we don't have a problem with reform and change per se, and we are willing to make concessions to your demands, but we have to first show you that we're in power. We have to have this show of force. We have to reassert our control. Then we're willing to make concessions. And basically, in this way, it's very difficult to dislodge the power of the Communist Party. They've taken the wind out of the sails of the reform movement, but at the same time, they've shown that they are in complete control of the countries in question. So bizarrely, paradoxically, after this very difficult period of war and invasion and occupation, which lasted for very many decades, of course, the Soviet army stayed in Hungary. After that, what emerged was something called goulash communism, goulash being the stew that is popular in Hungary, stew and gravy and potatoes, a lot of carbs. That became a sort of system. It became a relatively relaxed communist system. Still communist, still censorship, still complete control of the Communist Party, but much less strict than, for example, as we'll see in a couple of weeks' time, Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, to say nothing of countries like Romania in the 1970s and 80s, or Albania under Enver Hoxha. Okay, we'll leave it there, I think, and yeah, we'll leave it there.